and loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network, well, at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the original homepage at coalitionradio.us, where about 8 years of Coalition 1.0 and 2.0 shows can be heard, ranging interviews from Libertarian Party presidential candidate Gary Johnson, well, to folks like Stephen Brown of the Rhode Island American Civil Liberties Union, Gary Sass, known as, if you will, one of the great experts in New England on municipal finance. All of those interviews are there. And a show that we often refer to, a show that included a judge, a former mayor, a mayoral candidate, and we talked about the impending bankruptcy of Providence, Rhode Island. We weren't exactly clairvoyant. That was about 6 years ago. But, well, that's another show. Folks, this week I had the opportunity to participate, as I always do, in what is now the Governor McKee's COVID, if you will, press availability. We meet every Thursday afternoon at 1 o'clock at Veterans Memorial Auditorium. I recommend. It's a great spot. If you're looking to protest outside, they're pretty strict now about letting people in. But if you want to make some noise, the media is there. But that's our little secret. Every week I take a different shot at economics, at different issues, health-related, philosophical about the crisis. My tendency is not to engage in, if you will, the near obsession over COVID statistics, which are incredibly important. I'm not diminishing it. I'm not going to talk about whether 15 feet away or 20 feet away or 6 feet away. I'm not going to talk about double masking. I'm not going to talk about any of that. I'm going to ask questions that are salient to the economics, the philosophical, what I like to think are bigger picture questions. This week, and by the way, just as an aside, we don't know who of the supporting cast is going to show up. Obviously, the governor is going to be there, in this case now, the newly anointed Governor McKee. The head of the Rhode Island Department of Health, Dr. Scott, will be there. But there's 4 slots, and it's sort of a mixed rotating cast of head honchos, department directors, wannabes, coat hangers, you name it. Much to my surprise, this past week, someone who had been absent for months, Untitled Infante-Green, who is the guru, the honcho, the ruling leader, if you will, of Rhode Island education, showed up to grace us with questions. Obviously, she had a presentation in mind about Rhode Island schools, the state of Rhode Island schools in COVID. In the back of my mind was a question that I'd posited several times months ago when she was making routine appearances, and that, of course, is something called RICAS, and we're going to get into a conversation about that. Joining me is someone who is a repeat offender on the coalition and a valued activist, and someone who in just a couple of short years of activism has made a serious imprint, if you will, on the body politic here in Rhode Island. And by the way, answers questions, and this is one of my favorite things. I know someone's in it for the long term and is, as we say, wicked smart, because he or she answers questions that we didn't even know we had. And quite frankly, given the absence of any real imagination in Rhode Island government as it exists right now, we need more people like her. Of course, I'm talking about my friend Stephanie Meuse. She has been on the forefront, if you will, of teaching issues, charter school issues, school safety issues, since really the beginning, if you will, of the Corona era. Stephanie, I know it's late at night, but you joined us tonight so we could catch up with you and tape this segment. Thanks for joining us tonight. Well, it's well deserved. Again, it's funny. Crises have a way of folks reimagining themselves or not, folks emerging or not, folks becoming part of the conversation or not, and it defines people. And clearly, this has defined you. We are better because of your ongoing activism. Let's talk about it's been about a month or two since we last spoke, and that's shame on me. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what's happened really in the last 2 months or so. When we last spoke, it was folks were entering, if you will, re-entering schools post Thanksgiving. We were in one of the variety of purges, pauses, surges, relaxations, the sort of, and I failed to find a better term. I hate to use this term, but I'll call it the schizophrenic nature of Rhode Island educational politics. Where are we now? And I asked the commissioner, if you will, I thought a very straightforward question. So first of all, let's give your take on where we are now, and then we'll get into my question.
Oh my gosh, I feel like we could spend an hour on where we are now because it's going to be different depending on who you ask and where they're talking about. But where we are now is mostly across the state that schools are opening more. Teachers are being vaccinated. And we're kind of in this, if we were in the building, it would definitely be test prep season. So in or out of the building, that's kind of the thing on everyone's mind.
Testing obviously was the huge issue, and not so much is availability, because that really, I don't know, was the big impact on schools. But let's just say truth in advertising. There is right now the general consensus that people working at schools didn't get sick. That in fact, it was that schools are safe. They were always safe. And I'm not saying this to be provocative because I know how strongly you feel about it, but the conventional wisdom exists right now that COVID doesn't exist in the schools. What from your perspective as a teacher, boots on the ground, what is it really?
I mean, I am not an epidemiologist, clearly. I'm not a public health expert, but I don't feel like you have to be a rocket scientist to know that obviously COVID exists at schools if it exists in the community. Schools are part of our community. And kind of the way that people get around that is they're like, COVID doesn't spread in schools, it spreads in the community. So it doesn't just spread in schools. It spreads in this larger body, so we don't have to blame it on schools. Which fine, but it still spreads in schools. I think if you look at like the RIDO COVID dashboard, there have been hundreds, 1,000. I don't know how many cases in school, but there are cases in school. So yeah, and obviously those cases, right, they spread to homes, they spread to the people that the kids live with or the teachers live with. So I think this idea that COVID doesn't exist in schools is just wrong.
Balderdash? Well, to your point, first of all, is it possible to really measure where it comes from? In the larger sense, is that possible? And are they even attempted to measure or even understand where it comes from?
Now that testing is more widespread, you could make the argument that we catch kids who are or we're more likely to catch kids that are asymptomatic, right? But in the beginning, from like September until December, when we had absolutely no in-school testing or testing for kids at all on a large scale, like how could you know if a kid was asymptomatic and went home and spread it to their family member? Like there's no way to know that. And we know that Rhode Island was so far behind in contact tracing that like there's really just no record of where lots of people in Rhode Island got COVID. So we can't definitively say that it definitely came from schools, but I think to definitively say that it did not come from schools is gonna fall victim to the same flaws of logic, right?
Right. How well, from your perspective, and you're very active on social media, you're involved in a number of very large community Facebook pages. I mean, we're talking well in excess of 10,000 users. How effective was the whole theory and practice of pods at a variety of public schools, whether it be in Central Falls, Providence, Pawtucket? We'll call it the hot zone, if you will, of COVID. primarily because of the densely populated regions, large families, close family contact. Did they truly build out the pods, and did they adhere to the pods?
No. So pods were like the buzzword this summer when schools were planning. And that was in every school guidance that I saw, right? So every school was like, we're going to have this stable pod with the teacher and the kids, and it's going to make contact tracing easier. And that basically immediately fell apart. You never hear anyone talk about the pods anymore because they immediately fell apart, right? So like, first of all, kids are on buses with other children. They live at home with other children. You had specialist teachers traveling from classroom to classroom. You had interventionists traveling from classroom to classroom. And then also you had schools that couldn't staff their learning models, either because people were out as close contacts or people were out sick, or just too many families decided to stay home and their teaching staff was split between remote learning and in-person learning. Like there was just no pods once school started. September 14th, pods ended.
Do you think folks understand that? I mean, that certainly hasn't been discussed, if you will, in political polite conversation.
This disconnect between the people at like what's actually happening at school and the people who are talking about what's happening at school. Yeah, and that's not just my opinion, right? That's like I guess it is my opinion as a person who's reading all of these testimonies from teachers and parents who are like, yeah, that's actually not how contact tracing went when someone in my child's class came with a positive case. Yeah, when kids tested positive, they actually were not left in an isolation room. They were brought back to my classroom. There's not 3 feet of distance. My kids are like on top of each other in the classroom. It's just, there's a huge disconnect between what's actually been happening and still happening in schools, and what you'll hear either people from Brown or the state decide to say about schools.
Wow. Well, that's disheartening, as they say. I'll use the term, and this is my term, not yours. And I'm very careful when folks are kind enough to spend quality time with me to make sure that my opinions, if I mention them, are not confused with the guests. I call it the big lie. If you say something often enough, and this was defined by the Ronald Reagan era, ironically, the big lie is if you say something often enough, it becomes the truth. So you had this administration gone wild that was manifesting all these blatant mistruths, as we say in media, because the Lord lies awfully judgmental, week after week after week after week. I mean, the only thing is, God had mercy on me, and Gina Raimondo only mentioned the word Tiger teams once. Other than that, I might have jumped the stage. So this has all been nonsense, hasn't it? I mean, this has all been and I'm putting you on the spot here, but as someone who pays attention, it strikes me as having been one gigantic, elaborate scam. Am I overstating it?
No, you're not overstating it, right? And I think that this is not the first time maybe that people in education have felt that way, right? Like there's always this lofty conversation about what's happening in schools versus like what's actually happening in schools. But I think that this is the first time that it's been seen on such like a public arena. Yeah.
It is, couple this with the tragic amount of waste that happens on, particularly in schools at the administrative level, like Providence Schools, and couple this with, just despite heroic efforts by teachers, and in full disclosure, my wife's a teacher. She does not teach in a Rhode Island public school, but she is a teacher. Despite heroic efforts by teachers to overcome all sorts of issues, everything from language issues to differences in learning to crumbling infrastructure to parental neglect to fill in the blanks, and a collapse of test scores, we come to a moment in Rhode Island history where despite the admonitions of some, like myself, who thought that curriculums should have been simplified this year and real focus being on the basics of math and English, not just for the for educational reasons, but also for simplicity of delivery reasons, if you will, we come to school testing. And I asked the commissioner, there are states, and I mentioned Ohio and Colorado amongst them, whose state legislatures are passing legislation that would postpone their version of RICAS, and also ask for a waiver from the federal government for said postponement, and for a waiver from having to include any results in that testing to have any sort of impact on funding, teacher contracts, all of that, and to essentially take a breath. And my question, and folks, the video of that will be attached to the video that we share with Steph's appearance tonight. We pointed out the obvious, loss of classroom time due to COVID, the inability, and I tried to sandbag the, full disclosure, the commissioner, with the amount of time that is often for teaching to the test. That was gone. The logistical issues of actually conducting the test, distancing, all of that. Whether or not Rhode Island should, again, follow the states like Colorado and Ohio, who I believe have far more successful outcomes than we do here in Rhode Island, and take that deep breath. And her response was pretty firm. So I guess, first of all, talk to me about your reflections on RICAS, and explain it a little bit to folks, and then we'll get into the conversation with the Ms. Infante-Green.
Okay, so anyone who doesn't know what RICAS looks like in schools, it's our state standardized testing. It happens on a computer. Well, I think most districts take it on the computer. This year, every district will take it on a computer. But for a while, there was a transition between pen and paper and the computer. But it's an online test. Kids, fourth graders spend it got shortened last year, and then I think they added days back. It's between somewhere like 4 and 6 days that grades 3 through 8 spend, and I'm not sure what the secondary grades are, taking ELA and math tests. And there's a lot of prep that goes into it, both teaching kids the tech of how to actually navigate through the testing platform, and then also obviously teaching them. It's not the content of the test, but it's the specific language that you're only going to hear RICAS use, and you'll never probably hear again in your life. So that's what RICAS looks like. And I will say that I don't think it's entirely the commissioners. I don't think the commissioner is entirely to blame for Rhode Island schools being in the position where we're going to give children the standardized high stakes tests this year for some reason. I think that really it's a failure of the Secretary of Education and President Biden to allow blanket waivers for states, right? Her hands are kind of tied, which if they weren't tied, I'm not sure what she would do. But her hands are kind of tied. So she can postpone the test to summer or fall. And I'm not sure that I think that either of those would be better options. She can also shorten the test, which I hope that she will do. But there's really not a lot that she can do beyond that. But I will say that there are two important things that I do think that the commissioner could do, right? And one of those is that she could frame the way that we're talking about kids having to take this test, which all year she's been talking about kids' mental health and how they really need to be in school. And I just wonder what kind of message it sends to our children when many of them are returning to school for the first time, either just to take this test or just before this test is happening. What message does that send to them, and how is it the commissioner's job to reframe that? And then I think the second thing that she could do is right now, families are trying to really opt kids out. And I have families reporting back to me that their district administration is telling them that they need a medical exemption, like a signed note from a doctor to opt their children out of standardized testing. And that's not true. That's not what the SLA says. And that's not like what I think the SLA says, right? Like, I don't know what the SLA says. I've read it, but I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know exactly what it means. But the Washington Post and the Fair Test organization, they both say that the SLA protects families who want to opt their children out from testing. RIDE has a policy that conflicts with that. And I really think it would behoove the commissioner to at least change that policy. I mean, it should be changed forever if it's different than what the SLA says, but at least for this year, to give families the option to opt their students out. And she really hasn't made a move or signaled that that's something she's planning on doing.
Why is she seemingly an advocate for the test? What does successful or unsuccessful performance on the test overall do for the state of Rhode Island or the students?
Okay, so I have a few thoughts about that, right? So like like maybe it's a financial thing. Have we already paid Pearson? Has the state already like paid Pearson or whoever? It's probably Pearson, but I can't say that I know that for sure, but it's probably Pearson. Like, have we already paid them our yearly contract? Would we not get that back if there's not a federal waiver? So like maybe it's a financial thing. The thing that I hear most people say is that we just need to like figure out where kids are so we can figure out where to go with them. And that's a really sound idea, right? Like that makes a lot of sense, that of course we have to assess children's learning this year to know what to do with them next year when we're back in school. Because, I don't believe in the idea of learning loss, but like my fourth graders are definitely in a different place this year than they would have been if we were not living in a pandemic. And so, yeah, I think that's the argument of giving the test. But then I think I would say back to that, right, is that teachers don't, even before this year, teachers don't rely on RICAS data to plan instruction and curriculum for the next year. And that's because we don't even get RICAS data back until often October or early November of the following school year. And we're planning curriculum and instruction for students the summer before or the beginning of that school year. And we're not using RICAS to do that. And that's because teachers and schools have a lot of other less expensive ways of testing students to figure out where they know. And, ways of testing kids that are not quite so anxiety inducing either.
Mm-hmm. So how would you respond then? You've seen the video, you've seen our question, my question, I should say. And I don't pretend to be an educational, I should say expert on any level. I just had an opportunity, if you will, to put her on the spot and finally come out after a half a dozen times of asking months ago where we stood on RICAS and where we stood on standardized testing to answer that. Her contention was, as you pointed out, that, we need to know where kids are. Her contention was that the federal government was not going to issue any waivers, but they had issued something along the lines of like sort of a waiver of accountability. What did she mean by that? And what is your overall response to her response?
So I think that's true from what I understand, is that the federal government has said that states have to give it and they're not giving blanket waivers, but they've waived the accountability piece, which I think is like related to how much money schools and districts get and states get for how they perform.
Right.
So I think that this year the results aren't going to be linked to any funding.
Mm-hmm. So,
which is true.
If you don't get the data at a timely basis to really extrapolate any sort of vision, lesson plan, individualized teaching approach, and it takes kids out of the classroom for, by your account, close to a week? Never mind any preparation for kids understanding the structure of the test. And it costs money. And it takes valuable time away from already a dramatically convoluted, confused, and I'm making that statement in regards to everyone. I mean, I would clearly, Corona/COVID has destroyed, if you will, the ebb and flow, the structure, the groove, if you will, of individual school systems. It's just thrown it into chaos. And every week, as we pointed out when you and I were talking offline, schools around Rhode Island, around America are waking up to, oh, well, so-and-so is going to be gone for 14 days because of, someone in their family who knows someone in their family got ill, or a teacher whatever, for 100 different reasons. So with all this surrounding chaos and a need to spend more time with kids than ever, why are we doing this?
I mean, I think, right, I can sort of imagine how this plays out in the future. So she has her like LEAP task force that's one, not open to participation, as she claims. Like, it's
Right.
on YouTube. You can watch the task force happen. You cannot participate in it. And there's like 4 or 5 teachers on this giant panel of people. But regardless, right? So they have this LEAP task force. And that's kind of the way that the state is going to decide what programs they're going to put in place to mitigate learning loss, right? So there's like two separate educations that happen, right? There's like education by the school and the teacher in the classroom, and then there's education by like the state and what the state decides to do with the money. So when I'm talking about like teachers and classrooms and schools, like what am I as a teacher going to do to mitigate the learning loss that happened this year, right? I'm going to talk with the teachers in the grade level above me and the grade level below me, and I'm going to make individualized plans for the 20-something kids that I have in front of me next year. And I'm going to plan assessments with my school, and I'm going to ask for resources from my school, and plan curriculum with my colleagues, and that's what's going to happen in the school building to address school learning loss. People outside of the building don't actually have contact with children, right? So they can't do any of those things on an individual basis. So what they're going to do is decide how they're going to funnel federal and state money into programs to educate kids, right? So that's going to look like the LEAP task force is going to decide. I mean, I don't know what they're going to decide because I didn't watch the last one, but they're going to decide to like have wide summer school programs, or they're going to have like extended learning hours next year, or more after school programs, or like whatever thing they think is going to address the learning loss. But it's just they're like two completely different tracks, right? And the RICAS test scores are going to be used to justify the spending of money on this track over here outside of schools.
Oi. Well, that doesn't sound terribly productive.
Conversation about I watched a house. I'm sorry. I like a lot of the representatives in the House Education Committee are great, but watching them have a conversation about education was just, it's surreal. Like, it's surreal to watch people who are not in a school building, are not with children, are not in charge of educating them or teaching them, make decisions about what happens in those places. And that's a lot of what happens with the money that goes to schools and with the people who have these positions of leadership, right? Is that they're not doing the job of something that happens in a school building. They're doing the job of something that happens in education, which is really this thing that exists outside of school buildings.
So you've got this vast education industrial complex that is, and again, these are my opinions, largely self-serving, that have a passing, if at best, familiarity with what's happening at the school level and the forces and the true impact of COVID, as opposed to what the perceived public debate is about COVID. And we're just going to continue the trail of tears called education in this country. And I've got to digress for just a second too, because you're someone who's been very active in looking for opportunities to bring your truths, if you will, to these people. You've worked very hard, and as well as the people who work alongside you with, have worked very hard to sort of connect these two realities. So I've got to ask you, on a practical basis, the Zoomification, if you will, of public testimony, how frustrating has that been to you as an activist who's desperately trying to bring, I think, working in a positive manner to bring these two worlds together?
Actually, I love virtual testimony. I hate how it's being used and that there's no rules, right? Like, I think that what's been happening in the Providence City Council is like a perfect example of this, right? Like, people show up and they want to say something about the Providence Police Department, and they get shut down, or they raise their hands and aren't acknowledged, or they're signed up for testimony and get muted, or like whatever the thing is. That's terrible, right? Like, there should definitely be rules against that. That should not be happening. However, I think it's really amazing that virtual testimony has meant that, like, right, so like yesterday, the House Education Committee was hearing some bills. I wanted to testify. It was 3:30 in the afternoon. I have both my kids with me. calling in is way easier than having to like travel to the State House and give testimony. I would not have done it if I had to actually go to the State House. So I like that it's more accessible.
So if they could only just do it better, do it good, for lack of a
expertly, right? Like if the people at the RIDE meeting wanted to hear us, they absolutely would and could. I think it's that there's no rule that they have to.
Right. Although I'm about to challenge that because I sent the email in on time for once and requested to testify about some harm reduction legislation that was being brought up in terms of centers being established. And I did all the right things for once, and I did it on a timely basis for once. And I sat there for hours waiting for a phone call that never came. They didn't even bother to, they didn't even make the attempt to call me and put me on mute. So I plan on pursuing an open meetings challenge to that, because that's in direct violation, I believe, of the intent of the open meeting laws. You can't cite these exogenous events when, as you point out so aptly, the technology exists for people to adapt. Now, you may have to limit speaking times on some of the more contentious legislation, but the notion that we'll just send in a letter with how you think is going to fly, well, it doesn't, does it?
Yeah. And, I'd argue I don't think that you have to limit speaking times.
I'm until I show up, right?
To say than the people giving the testimony. Like, if we're not limiting their time, why are you limiting the people giving testimonies time? That doesn't make any sense.
Well, I mean, you and I have done our share of testimony, and we show up when the meeting, this sort of unknown time, at the opening of the session. So, you're right. Thank God we don't have to drive there anymore and fight for the few parking spots, right? You show up and you don't know when your bill is going to be heard, if it's going to be heard. And then the whole unknown, the whole amorphous, maybe you'll be the one who gets the phone call, maybe you won't. All of that's happening. My frustration is that you get the usual suspects who go first, the folks who are either tied to or, literally the folks who wrote the bill, who have already had plenty of time to write the bill. Do we really need to hear them repeat what they said, that they put into writing the bill? But what strikes me as crazy is that folks like yourself, who are accomplished teachers and who are willing to, on a voluntary basis, give your real world, very local, very on-point experiences with exactly what they're debating at, and they're not looking to aggressively allow you to participate. That's just crazy. If your heart is looking for the best outcome, why would I preclude the involvement of someone who's literally on the front lines? I mean, you're a teacher, you're a mom, you've got young children, you've got extensive experience, you're highly accredited, you've got a great education, and you're there for free. What's the disconnect here? What am I missing?
You're not missing anything. I think you said it when, you said if your heart is in whatever your exact quote was, right? If your heart is in the right place, you want to hear the people. I think the flip of that, right, is that if you don't want to hear the people, your heart is maybe not in the right place. I can't really think of another explanation for other. It's like inconvenient, right? It's inconvenient to hear what's actually going on when it doesn't match. You basically have everybody who's in education. They're like grant writers. They're writing grants to get money. And then when you hear the testimony that doesn't match the narrative of your grant, it's inconvenient. Yeah. And it might mean.
Right. We're just literally a couple of months away from the end of the school year. And this is the school year where, and you know, because I go to the press conferences, I listen to the commissioner. This is the school year where they were going to get it right. Now, we all understood that the prior year was a cluster of unimaginable proportions because this was dropped like a bomb into the midst of the school year without any warning, no anticipation. How is it reasonable to expect, you know, for us to get it right the first time? But let's review briefly everything we've talked about tonight. Pods were a significant part of the approach. By your account, and please correct me if I misspeak here, by your account, that those did not work. I'm going to be positive for once, in the sense that I'm not going to engage in a lot of rhetoric. I could say something like they were a complete failure and they were a public relations move to assuage the fears of a parental population, but I won't. If the whole notion that there would be trained substitutes, we didn't really cover this that much, but that there would be adequate workforce in place to cover for those folks who had to go into either, God forbid, a medical facility because they'd gotten COVID, or more commonly had to go into quarantine because someone they were associated with. I'm assuming that that's following the same path here. I'm hearing too many stories of just kids getting shuttled around all day. You know, and has, by the way, just as an aside, has there been any real work that you're aware of? And when I say professionalize the substitute teaching force, I don't mean in their personal sense, because I've met a lot of substitute teachers, highly qualified individuals who are substitutes either for lifestyle reasons or are waiting for an opening in the Providence schools or in public schools. So a lot of the substitutes I've found that I've met personally are highly qualified. But when I talk about the professionalization of it, I mean the ability to deliver substitutes on a timely basis in an efficient manner and have enough on staff to cover these unexpected shortages. Is any work being done at that at any level that you're aware of?
A lot of school districts actually they changed the qualifications for who could sub in a district. I don't know what those specifically are. It might vary district to district, but a lot of districts have changed who they'll hire to be substitutes. A lot of guest teachers, oh my goodness, it's late. A lot of districts have increased the amount that they'll pay per diem for substitutes. And I think both of those have allowed schools to fill a little bit of a gap, right? But then you're putting people, you're just like shuttling people into a system that's really broken, and it doesn't. It puts a warm body in a room.
So I guess if you were a betting woman, if you were, and they were running the odds on this down on the sports book at Twin River, because this is Rhode Island, we bet on everything, right? What's going to happen? Do you think? I mean, do you have any? Are you willing to hazard a guess, not to hold to a number, but overall, what's going to happen to these test scores that we're really not going to find out about, until midway through the next academic year?
The bet on that, they're not going to be great. And the reason they're not going to be great is because they weren't great before the pandemic, right? They're definitely not getting better. But Rhode Island wasn't performing that great overall before the pandemic. So they're probably not going to be great. Right. And I think that it'll probably just lead to the commissioner's rhetoric being that remote learning was a failure, that districts, right. And it's really unfortunate because some of the lower performing districts were also the districts who were hardest hit by COVID. Right. So that's going to lead to the commissioner being able to say things like, look at the results. Remote learning was a failure. And I think my question just back toward the state would be like, what responsibility do you have for that? Right? Like, we knew remote learning was going to be a part of the school year. Actually, a third of Rhode Island families chose to keep their kids home every single day this school year. And we knew that even if families chose to send their kids to school, that they would be remote learning at least some days this year because of quarantine, because of inclement weather, for whatever reason. And the state invested no time and no energy into making remote learning at all even adequate, right? And so to what responsibility does the commissioner and the state have for a poor turnaround of test scores? That's a question that I have.
And I would ask you, and again, I'm just a general thought. Clearly, Governor Raimondo had, who ultimately runs the show or ran the show. Clearly, the governor had an emotional / political / spiritual investment in maintaining what some people would argue is the fiction that schools had to be open. I guess how much of that non-response do you think is based on the governor trying to have a predictive outcome, in the sense that it doesn't work for her if distance learning worked?
Yeah, I think, right, that isn't that the nature of being a politician? Like,
Wow.
I think that is politics, right? Like, you have a thing that you want to be true, and I'm not going to say twist the facts. That's a little accusatory.
That's my
You
job.
like have a lot of power. You have a lot of power to make it look like the thing you said was true was true.
Yep. Wow. There you go. We clearly don't know what direction COVID is going to take. There are these outliers, these variants that folks talk about. There's real question as to, what the impact of these variants are going to be over the summer. Has Rhode Island learned anything from this, from your perspective as both an insider in terms of being a teacher, but also as a very involved outsider looking into the political process and being part of the political process? Do you think we've learned anything as a state?
I'm gonna say something hopeful and positive. I really think that a lot of the rhetoric in many different places, including at the state level, has been this idea that it's like teachers versus parents. And I think that one thing that I hope will last is that teachers and families have really realized, not just teachers and families, like anybody who's not part of the state has realized that maybe the state is not their friend. And maybe the state doesn't have their best interest in mind all of the time. And I think that was a really hard lesson for Rhode Islanders to learn, especially when we started the pandemic, being like, that's our governor, look at her protecting us. And then things just like went wildly downhill. And I think it caused people to be like, what was in it for her in March to protect us? And was it really about me or was it about her? Mm-hmm. Right. And then like watching it kind of all fall apart as the year progressed. I think it's really energized a lot of people to be like, just question what's happening at a state level and at a political level and how it affects them.
Wow. That's in its own very positive way. That's a powerful indictment of Rhode Island state government. It really is. If you had one thing to say to now Governor McKee, who in a very real sense has got 2 years, he's obviously been very pro-charter, and that's a whole nother conversation. But let's step away from that and let's just assume, and I believe this to be true, that Governor McKee is, from my perspective, is very caring about children's education. And we may or may not disagree on his approach, but I believe at least he deserves something of a honeymoon and a clean slate. What would you say to him if he were to include you in a private conversation about what should be done for the next 2 years while he's still governor?
I think that my best advice to him would just be to listen, just to listen. As involved in education as he is and has been, I think what I would tell him is just to really listen and not assume that involvement in education is the same thing as knowing about education. I don't want to say anything too derogatory about our new governor.
There's a lot of armchair experts. I'm one of them. I'm not an expert, but I literally play one on the radio. Who we have our own personal theories and our own personal worldviews, shaped by very personal experiences, and and that colors our interpretation of what the state should do, as opposed to what the state really should do. And there's a lot of urban legends out there. There's a lot of myths about education. And clearly a lot of people, not the teachers, but a lot of people are making a lot of money off of education without any real accountability. So this is probably the simplest question I'll ask you tonight in closing. Should the governor get more teachers involved in the conversation?
It's yes, absolutely. I wanted to close by reminding people of two things, and one of them is related to what you just asked me. So the first thing I want to get out there is just to remind any parents listening that despite what the state will tell you, you absolutely have the right to opt your children out of state testing. It's just inarguable. That's what the SLA says. RIDE's policy can't override that. You can opt your children out of state testing. And even if they told you you couldn't, you could just keep them home. The second thing I want to close on saying is actually about two bills that are in the House Education Committee. And one of them is kind of an answer to what you just said. So there's this bill that's being heard on Wednesday that's called the Holocaust and Genocide Commission Act or bill or whatever it is, and which sounds really good. But what it is this bill that will make it so that 15 people can come together to talk about Holocaust and genocide education in schools. And like 3 of those people actually have to be involved in schools in any way, which is ridiculous. So yes, teachers should definitely have more of a seat at a table. If you're like thinking of making an education committee or commission or study group, it should definitely be mostly people who are with children most of the time. And then the second thing I wanted to bring up, which is related to that, is another bill which is in the House on Wednesday, Bill 5354, which is an anti-bullying bill. But there's actually a whole section in it that's kind of an anti-protesting bill. And it would allow schools to suspend or expel students for inciting any acts that result in truancy, defying authority, or occupying any part of a school campus without permission. And to really watch that, because it's not anti-bullying, it's an anti-protest section of this anti-bullying act that's being heard on Wednesday.
And if I have to remind people, it was graduated students of Rhode Island Schools who are effectively suing the state so that they can get an education in civics, so that they could understand their civil rights. So what we don't need is the imposition of more suppression on student voices. When students are involved at that level, they're also emotionally and politically involved in the product itself, which should be obvious to all is self-fulfilling. Now is not the time to take people away from the table. Now is the time to include more people in the conversation, because I think the one thing we'll all agree on right now, nothing's working very well. So, listen, again, thanks so much for joining us tonight. I know this was a late call, but we can get this out into social media and conversation. Where can folks reach out to you? I know you're involved in a couple of Facebook groups that have just enormous participation. If you want to tell us about those, great. Or how can they have a conversation with you virtually to weigh in on this or to become volunteers?
Sure. So you can find me on Twitter, expressing opinions that are all my own, detached from any school district at Safe Return RI. And you can also find me on Facebook in the Rhode Island Parents and Educators for Safe Schools group.
Excellent. Well, I not only do I admire your work ethic and your participation, but your willingness not to sit back like so many do and simply pontificate or bitch or moan about a problem, but not only work at it professionally and dedicate your professional life towards educating young people, but your willingness on those rare hours, and I'm married to a teacher, so I understand, those rare hours that you have off to reinforcing that support for education for our children. You're a double-edged weapon there, Stephanie. So please keep at it. And offline, why don't you, if you could, just send me links to those bills so that that we can share your efforts at educating folks about those bills, particularly the quote-unquote, air quotes, anti-bullying bill, because students, we need to give students the belief and the practices and incorporate into their personal philosophies the notion from a very young age that not only can they be involved, they can be participants, they can be determinants of their own educational outcome. And giving them that power, as I mentioned, I think just makes the process, makes everything just simply better. So we'll have you on again soon. Please, let's. We went a month. We went a month or so without talking, and we should, particularly through the balance of the school year. You're allowed a break during the summer a little bit, but during the balance of the school year, I think it's about to get pretty heated. So I look forward to your continued visits here at the Coalition. All right, buddy. We are the Coalition, loud and proud. Outrage, porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. Folks, as always, we ask you to like, follow, share, all that stuff, not just for the ego, but quite frankly, social media is the one mechanism that we get that brings us out and gives our views and our listeners and our guests like Stephanie an opportunity to promote their message, to discuss their message, gain a greater understanding above the white noise that is the conventional media. Folks, we're going to shut it down for tonight. We'll be back on the air soon. Thank you for joining us.